All right, we're back. We are MAPD124, Advanced iOS Development, and it's week 12 in the winter 2017 semester, part 2 of our broadcast. We're talking about Unity3D and iOS game development. Actually, we should have called it Unity3D and anywhere development. You can actually deploy it all kinds of devices with Unity3D. So what is Unity3D? The site, please. You can get it here. And the latest version of Unity is 5.6, which has just been released. So what is it? It is a cross-platform game engine that is available for free, right, for individuals, for personal use. So if I click Get Unity, there are different plans. Again, there's the free plan, which says all features for beginners and hobbyists to get started, right? And then there's the Plus plan and the Pro and Enterprise. Now, the way you make money, if you actually use Unity to make your game, even today, right, you can still make money with it, but there's a limit. The more money you make, the more they take, right? But, you know, at the end of the day, who cares? If you're going to make money from your app and you make a Unity app, woohoo, all the power to you, right? This is a good start, and it basically gives you most of the features, right? There are some additional features in Plus and Pro, but most of the features are the stuff that you get online and some additional shaders and a bunch of other things that you can get that you can't get on with Personal. But for the most part, and I'm saying 90%, you can get started with Personal and be happy. Here's all the stuff you get. So revenue capacity up to 100K. Can't make more with that in Personal, right? And you're going to say, if I make 100,000, that's fantastic, right? Yeah, great, and it's a great start. That's why it's a good place to begin with. You can't get performance reporting or asset kits or source code access. A bunch of other stuff you can't get. But with the more pro versions, you can get access to everything. When you get source code access, that means you can modify Unity and make it your own game engine. Modify it to make it your own. Now, does anyone know what a game engine is? Think about this. If you started from scratch, if you and I started from scratch coding like low-level C++, right? And we had to set up everything, all my code and everything to access the GPU. There's a lot of work involved. It would take me probably a year or more to develop something that's half usable. And I'm not even talking about that great. If I had a group of developers working for a year or more, it might take me even that long, even if they're experienced developers, to put up a really cool game engine that does a lot of little things. Could I develop a game with it? Absolutely. But what if I wanted to make 5 games, 10 games, 20 games? It'd be really hard to do, right? So you need to develop a game engine. The game engine, what it does is it takes care of things like laying things out on the screen, moving your characters around, whatever it's going to be, scoring, user interfaces, buttons, all that kind of stuff. You have to program that from scratch, but Unity's all done it for you. I have to also tell you, beyond Unity, there's also the other one that's really popular is Unreal. All right, those are the two, Unreal and Unity. They're both free, but they have different models, right? The Unreal game engine, this is interesting. The Unreal game engine, what it does is it doesn't focus on 100K. It takes 5% of your take or something like that. 5% of your total profits, right? It's like out of everything, which is pretty high, right? By the way, that's not including the 35% that Apple will take, right? When you put it up on the App Store, Apple takes 35% of your loot. I would say your profit, right? Takes it all, 35%. That's pretty huge, right? So 35% plus the 5% which is pretty high for Unreal. If you make a lot of money, 5% of 100,000, right, is okay. But 5% of 500,000, that becomes not good, right? And there's better plans, and that's why they give you the ability for you to download your own version. So Unreal Engine, it's really, really cool. Definitely another option. And if you wanted to do something like download or whatever, if I click download, right, you have to subscribe to. I already have a subscription to your Epic Games, and then from there you can download Unreal. But for us, we're downloading Unity, and the way to do that is to click Download Now. It's going to take you to your download screen. And now just beware, this is about between 20 and 30 gigs, depending on what you download, right? So it can be pretty large, right? But once you set it up, you're away you go. Now the systems in front of you should have Unity installed. So check the system in front of you if you want to play with me today. They may not have 5.6, but they might have 5.5. So the ones that the systems that are in front of you, but not the Macs. They'll be on the the PCs if you want to check it out. If you're deploying to iOS, one thing I have to mention is you need a Mac, right? There is no way around it. Even though if it has Mac support, when you download and install Unity, you need a Mac to actually do the support, right? That's why having a Mac in general is a good investment if you're going to make games for mobile, because at the end of the day, you need it for deploying things to both iOS and Android, right? If you're like an independent developer. All right, so let's say I've gone through the process, I've downloaded Unity, and I installed it. Now, there's a lot of different options for Unity when you install it, a lot of them. My recommendation is install it all. You know what? You can always uninstall or not use some of it. But if you need something, you need to go through the process of installing it again. So I wouldn't recommend doing it later. Do it all once up front. Get it done. And that's why I'm telling you, it could be up to 30 gigs, depending on what you download. All right, so what does it look like? So I'm going to bring up Unity. So my version is 5.6. I'm using a Mac. My Mac version is going to be slightly different than yours. But what you do when you get going is it looks something like this, right? Where you have your projects and you have Learn, right? I'm going to create a new project here that I'm going to put up on GitHub for you today. One thing to note is that Unity does not play well with GitHub at all, right? It uses its own version control system. So let's say, for example, I make this new project, MAPD124, and this one I can't use dashes, no problem. And then the winter 2017 semester, lesson 12. We're going to do lesson 12 Unity because we already have a lesson 12 online, right? There's two types of games you can make with Unity, right? From the get-go. Notice there's a 3D game and there's a 2D game, right? I'm going to make a 3D application today with you, right? But you can make it with 2D as well. Either way, what you're changing here is some settings for the camera, which we'll talk about in a second. You can turn off analytics for us for today is not required. You need to set it so it goes to a particular location, right? So you can find it. And then I'm going to create my project. Notice that I'm logged in. The only way you can download and install Unity and run it is if you physically create an account with Unity. So that's one of your first things you should do. Create my project. All right, cool. So my project is being created. And when it's done, you're going to have the Unity screen coming up, the Unity interface. Okay, this is what it looks like, right? Now, when you start off, you may not see this split like this. You might see something that looks like this. This is the default view, okay? And you're looking at it going, okay, what is this Unity thing? What am I looking at here? Where are all the controls? Well, it's not a Microsoft application, right? So things that you would expect to be in a certain spot aren't in the spot that you're looking at here, right? Unity is something that's evolved. It's not something that happened all at once. Like Xcode, it came from the very beginning in a different setup. Each one of these panels that you see here, for example, the inspector panel, or the project panel, or the console panel, or the hierarchy, or the scene, or the game, any one of these panels can be ripped off and moved anywhere you want, even floating, right? Which is kind of good from from a custom work perspective, right? You want a kind of a different workflow. Maybe you want to have your inspector hover. You can do that if you want, right? Myself, I don't like this setting for a couple of reasons. One, I don't like my hierarchy and my stuff to happen on the left. I want my things to happen on the right. So there's another setting for this. Under default, you can see that there's many different kinds, and you can set up your own. I have set up my own, like Tom's layout. But let's start off by 2x3, right? 2x3 is the layout that I recommend to start off with. Why? You've got your scene window and you've got your game window. And I'm going to talk about what scene does in a second. Scene is where you actually have your objects that you drag and drop into your game, okay? With Unity, you're going to use either C# or JavaScript to code your game, okay? I don't recommend JavaScript. That's just like for someone who really doesn't know C#. And when you use C#, you're not really using C#, not really. You're using a C#-like scripting language, right, to access the Unity API, okay? It is C#. You can do almost everything with it, but there are some minor differences, and there's some things that you would do differently in Unity than regular C#. Okay, so that's why I say C# like, although it is C#. So this is your kind of your setup. Now notice this is kind of bunched together. I don't like that too much. And my hierarchy's got this is where all the objects in my scene would appear. For example, I've got my camera and my directional light and all this kind of stuff. It looks pretty crowded to me. So what I like to do is take my project and drag and drop it underneath my hierarchy over here, like this. Okay. I'm just setting up your, the way the view looks. Then I'm going to pull things over a little bit. Notice I have more room over here now, right? Okay. The inspector is one of the most important panels that you're going to use with Unity, because what it does is it's context sensitive. Think about this as the inspector on Xcode, right? Anything I click on the left shows up on the right, right? It's context sensitive. So example, right now I'm looking at my directional light. That's what I've clicked on, right? And that's why it says directional light up here, right? Notice it also gives me something called a transform. And Unity, what it does is it breaks up its components or objects on the screen into something called components. It uses a component model, right? This is the game engine. Every object that you put on the screen must have a transform component. It must have position, rotation, and scale. Every object, right? That's the default component. In fact, every object inherits from something called game object. Okay, so game object is a superclass that all other objects inherit from. Okay, including the main camera and all lights. Okay, so component here will be transform. Component here will be the light component, and I can make any component into a light or a camera or anything else I want. But there are some built-in components that you can, or built-in objects that you can add to your hierarchy. Your hierarchy is a list of objects that you're displaying inside of my scene. My scene, I want you to think about the scene as the container that is your game world. If you want to think about your game level, your entire level, and this could be like deep, like an entire world, virtual world can live in here, in this scene right here. And I can have many scenes inside of my game. Okay, we'll talk about thinking about what scenes are. If you ever played any first-person shooter, when you're outside, that could be part of a scene. As you move, sometimes it gets you to load, right? That's another scene that's loading in, right? What if you go inside of a house or in a spaceship or inside of something else? That could be another scene. You could have scenes that are accessible from inside of other scenes and so on, right? But each one of those scenes is its own level or virtual world. It has its coordinate system, right? And the coordinate system starts off at 0, 0, 0. When you're starting off with 3D, you have X, Y, and Z coordinates, right? Same thing with rotation and same thing with scale, right? Now, this is really crowded for me. The game window here actually shows me what I'm physically seeing with my camera. And as you can see, there's nothing in the scene other than a light, so I don't see anything right now. It just looks like the skybox, some kind of sky. So I want to take this game and I want to kind of tear it and put it next to here so I can see what my scene looks like. This is a little bit easier for me to work with, right? So that's what I recommend this view here. Starting off on the left, you see some buttons. The top left button here, the hand button, if I click on it, I can move my scene around just by clicking and holding my mouse button. To do Unity properly, you must have a 3-button mouse, all right? If you try and use the touchpad, you'll be gravely disappointed, right? And the reason for this is because any kind of 3D software, game engine, whatever, whether you're using Blender, Maya, or 3D Studio Max, anything to use to make your game, you need a 3-button mouse. So go and buy one, guys, over the next couple weeks, right? It costs, I can probably get it for you, a 3-button wired mouse for $8, right? On Amazon, you can buy them in bulk, all right, wired. A wireless mouse here at the bookstore is $25, okay, if you really want to spend that kind of money. But you need a 3-button mouse. You cannot survive without it. You can't use the Apple mouse. That won't work, right? Because even though it gives you some excellent flexibility in terms of gestures and everything else, it still does not do what you need to do here with the 3-button mouse. Why? because not only does it allow me to move around in my scene. I'm just going to unplug here and plug it back in. I think I locked myself out. But notice that, so with my hand, I can kind of go left and right. I can kind of move my entire scene up and down. It's hard to see, but that's what I can do, right? If I click this, what looks like a cross, right, with arrows, right, I actually come up with a gizmo, right? Now, this is not a great object to look at with a gizmo. The camera is kind of a better object to look like this, right? The gizmo allows me to move my objects in three-dimensional space, right? Let me add another object just to give you an idea. Notice that I have my main camera, my directional light, and those are the two objects. I could do the following. On the top left here, it says create. I could click create and create a three-dimensional object like a cube. And now it's going to be added into the scene, right? This is my cube. Notice now that when I pan around with my hand, I can move the cube, my view of the cube around until even if it's off screen. Hey, now that the cube is off screen, is it in my game? What do you think? If it's off screen, is it part of my game? Yes, right? Even though an object is off screen, just like it would be at any other user interface, doesn't mean it's not part of your game. It's just not being rendered. And rendered is a fancy word for being drawn. Okay, so it's not being drawn, but however, it's still here. I can pull it into my scene. And so if I place objects in three-dimensional space, anywhere in my scene, they will remain there unless I move them or do something to them, right? And this is how you would build out your level. Okay, so I got my cube. But if I click this button here, like I showed you, with my cube selected, there are three arrows that come up. This is called the gizmo, right? What the gizmo has is the ability for you to move your object in three-dimensional space across different axes. The red axis represents the X coordinate system. And if I click and hold my red arrow, I can move my object in three-dimensional space anywhere inside on the X axis, right? The blue axis, like it says here, is the Z axis, right? And I can move this around anywhere else, right, in three-dimensional space. And of course, the green axis is the Y axis, and I can move that up and down in three-dimensional space. By the way, these colors are the same color we use across every program that does three-dimensional work at all. Maya, Blender, 3D Studio Max, ZBrush, whatever you want to use, we use the same colors because they represent the normals when it comes to looking at a particular object. Don't worry about what the normals are right now, but I want you to think about them in terms of these are the standard colors that we use for those directions. If I click on the middle of the cube itself, I have free reign of where I want to move it around. I don't have to go. I don't have to be constrained to moving it in a certain place. Notice that when the cube is closer, right, to me, to the viewport, right? This is the viewport. This thing here, this scene is the viewport, right? And as the cube moves closer to me, it appears to be bigger. Is it bigger? Am I actually looking at a three-dimensional object? Think about it. Is the cube really 3D? No, the cube is 2D, but it looks like it's 3D. And it's looking like it's 3D because I'm looking at it with a perspective view. This is my perspective view, right? I can also look at this cube itself with an orthographic view. But as it goes farther away, our eyes in real life look at objects that are farther away. And as they're farther away, they're actually smaller, right, to our eye. But in real life, they're the same size. And like I told my other class the other day when I was doing this, you ever look at the CN Tower and kind of put your fingers on it like this? And then, you know, kind of imagine that you're holding the CN Tower in your hand? You ever do that with some kind of object? I used to do that as a kid, right? The reason why you can do that with a tower is because it almost looks like it's really that small, like it can fit between your fingers. But in real life, it's really massive, right? Because our eye sees things that are farther away smaller, right? And things that are closer up larger. Like, for example, if I put my finger really close to my eye, it blocks my entire field of view, and so it looks really massive. This is perspective. And video games, what they do with three-dimensional games, and in fact, they use a camera that has a perspective projection. Here it is right here, perspective. I can also change my camera so that it sees things in orthographic view. And orthographic means it sees everything the same size. We'll come back to that in a second. So here's my cube. right? And notice that on the right, if I click on my cube, you can see I have certain coordinates. These are floating point numbers, right? That I can assign in the X, Y, and Z coordinate systems, right? So if I put this at the origin, which is 0, 0, 0, I could simply write them in like 0, 0, 0, right? Or I can go back to this little cog here, this little gear, and I can just put reset. And that would put my cube at the origin in three-dimensional space relative to world space, right? Notice that my camera is not at the origin, right? But it can also, as a preview, can see my cube right here. If I look at my camera now, it looks like it's looking at my cube head on. And I can't tell that it's a cube. It looks like a square, right? To play with this concept for a second, I'm going to put this side by side, right? Remember, I can tear these off the way I want them, right? So here's my camera. And as I come closer to my cube, right, you can see what the game would look like in real life, right? I can also move my camera higher and rotate my camera. Anything can be rotated by pressing this button. I can rotate it across different axes, right? I can also rotate it, you know, and you can see that the angle of rotation is right here. So I can numerically do it as well as use my eye to rotate the angle, right? So if I want this rotation to be exactly 20 degrees, I can certainly do that. And I can change my angle to -5, let's say, or 0, or whatever I want, right? As you can see, right? So rotation is this one. This one is movement. And this one is scaling, right? I want my object here, my cube, to be much larger. And if I was going to move this, I'll move this over here again so you can see it. If I want to move my cube so it's larger, and I'm going to zoom out again. Zooming in and out, by the way, is done with your mouse wheel. That's why you need a three-dimensional mouse, right? Or three-button mouse, right? You can't do it with so easily unless you have your a wheel on your mouse somehow. If I use my mouse pad, here's my touchpad. It doesn't do it. If I use 2 fingers, though, 2 fingers will do it for you. So if you don't have a mouse, a three-point mouse or whatever, or button mouse, you can do this with your 2 fingers, right? You can also pinch and zoom, right? If I actually, you know, hold it down and I try and zoom around, it does some weird things with three fingers. But again, that's why I'm recommending you get your 3-button mouse. Let's go back to what I did before with my. I just unplugged it with my my view, right? So here I've clicked on this scaling, and again I can scale in 1 dimension, right? When I scale an object, right? You can see how it springs back, right? So I can do one of these, right? But in general, I'll tell you this, I don't scale objects too much in Unity. Unity is not an object creation program. It's not used for you to model or do anything like that. It's not for that. It's a game engine, right? We do modeling in a separate program like 3D Studio Max or Maya or Blender or whatever. Blender is an open source program that I use a lot, right? So those are the things we do. We do modeling. We don't do modeling inside Unity. Can you do modeling inside Unity? There are extension packs you can download from the asset store. And the asset store is going to be your best friend when you're making Unity projects for the first time. There's lots of stuff you can download from there. In fact, you can download almost the entire game if you really want to. But again, you do it for learning purposes, not to sell it or put it on Steam. So that's what you can do with these 3 buttons. And these buttons here can be all accessible with your fingers too. Q is the hand. W is this gizmo that moves things around, right? E is rotation. R is scaling. And then T does something totally different, right? It actually moves things or scales things in different dimensions altogether by selecting this altogether. All right, so those are the buttons that you have up on top here, right? This is your scene view, right? Or the ability for you to look at your viewport. And your game view actually is actually showing you what you will actually see at the end. Well, notice that it's all white. Why is that? Well, let me take a look at the camera and see what the main camera sees. The main camera is like right on top of this object, right? And that's why it sees what it sees. So if I was to move this thing around, right, and then go back to my game, oops, that's 2D. go back to my game for a second, you can see that what I see is the object is way over here now. Okay, why? Because that's what my camera sees, right? This is the preview right down here. What about panning around the scene? Sometimes I want to tumble around the scene to see something in it, and this is where you need your 3-button mouse again. If I click Option and left mouse button, I can literally rotate around the entire scene to see what the camera sees, right? Notice how the camera is looking outward, right, from this view. The camera is the key point in Unity, because what it does with it, when you look through the camera, is it simulates what you would see if you were physically looking through a camera, right? And that's what the player sees, okay? Anything outside of the camera's view doesn't exist as far as the player is concerned. Only when it's inside the view can we actually see it, right? As you can see. Okay? So the camera. Zooming in, zooming out. If I press the right mouse button, right mouse button, and kind of go up and down, I can kind of pan up and down from here. It's not exactly the same as tumbling. Okay, this is tumbling around a central point, right? I can pan around this way, okay? I can tumble with my left mouse button. Okay, totally different view. And if I press the Command or Control key, and I use my my Option key or Alt on Windows machines, and I use my right mouse button, I can also zoom in and out. I zoom in and out. Right, so that's why you need your right mouse button, or the ability if you have a 3-button mouse. Okay, so just navigation around the scene. All right. Again, this is a preview, but notice over here what it's showing. It's showing free aspect, and we're using iOS games. So we're going to go back to what we're doing here. I want to make a 3-dimensional game for iOS devices or for Android devices. Well, you know what? I can't see it as free aspect. This doesn't make any sense for me. I can change it so it is a different aspect altogether, right? And you can set your aspect on the left over here, whatever you want. And usually it's some kind of a view that allows you to simulate what it would look like on a device, right? We'll get back to this in a second. Right now, free aspect means it'll model itself to any device it's deployed on. It'll change sizes and everything else. It'll be responsive, right? I don't recommend this for beginners, right? This is complex because you have to modify everything to make it work. Okay. Simple stuff. Let's get rid of the cube for a second, which doesn't look like a cube anymore because I've modified it all to hell, right? And let me show you an interesting workflow. So here I have nothing in my scene is pretty empty. I only have my main camera and my directional light. And inside my project is where everything lives in Unity, right? On the bottom here, it looks like I'm looking at assets, right? Assets is kind of the top level folder for everything that's inside of Unity that we can use. Everything is an asset. A light is an asset. A material is an asset. A texture is an asset. A sound is an asset. A player is an asset. Whatever you think about, anything you put into the game is an asset. But I want to break the assets down into subfolders. And here are my recommendations. Right-click on inside of your assets folder and create a new folder. And I want to put in something called scripts. Here's my scripts folder. Notice that it's a big folder. I don't like this view. And on the bottom, you have this little slider. You can slide it bigger, or you can slide it all the way down until it becomes a list. And I prefer list view for my folders. Now, this is not, maybe you don't like it this way, but I want to pull my slider as far to the left as possible. I want to add some more folders in the beginning. So I want to add scripts, underscore scenes. Notice I'm putting the underscore in there. I'm putting the underscore so that they pop up at the top. Scenes and scripts, and I like them putting it kind of appearing at the top of my assets, because I'm going to put scripts, a lot of scripts in my code, and I want to be able to switch between different scenes. The rest, I organize like this. New folder, models, right? New folder, textures. Textures is a funny word when we talk about games, right? Think about textures, not something that you can touch. When we think textures, we think about like, I touch a texture, like I touch my jacket, and it has kind of a slippery feel to it. I touch a carpet, and it's kind of fuzzy feel to it, right? I touch my hair, and it's kind of have a, fibrous feel to it, or whatever, right? That's not what we mean when we talk about textures. at all when it comes to game development, right? Or maybe sometimes you want to eat something and you feel there's a texture to the food that you eat as well, and for a lot of us we like that, like for example, I used the other day I used the example of beef tripe. If you like beef tripe, there's a different taste and a texture to beef tripe to make it interesting to eat for some people. I'm not a beef tripe eater, but some people like it, right? That's not what we're talking about when we mean textures. For us, I want you to think about them as images, right? Okay, that's what they are more than anything else. There's a grouping of images, but we can also use textures to kind of think about, we can sample from textures as well. We can look at an image and use it as something we can sample from. So models, textures, materials is another thing. Let's put a new folder called materials. Whenever we think about materials, I want you to think about the way that light is being displayed on a particular object, right? Materials represent the shader, right? Usually that is being used, and other kind of properties that we apply to an object. Think about it as a skin that wraps around a mesh, an object, right? And the skin itself that we're wrapping it around with, it can have different properties, right? So materials, models, textures. The one I like a lot is prefabs. We'll talk a lot about that one as well. So we'll make another folder called prefabs. Think about prefabs as prefabricated objects. Objects that you've created with Unity by combining them or importing them from other programs and adding things like scripts and everything to make them work. A good example of a prefab is an enemy. Let's say, for example, you download a texture and a model for the enemy, and you build materials and everything else to make that enemy look like it's supposed to look. Then you add scripts so the enemy reacts in a certain way. It has artificial intelligence. It follows you around or whatever. And let's say I want to have not just one of these enemies, but 1,000 of them. So I create them as a prefab that I can drag and drop into my scene over and over again. That's what a prefab is. Think about it as an object that's been instantiated over and over in your scene. In fact, anything that's inside of your hierarchy at game time, when you first press play, is instantiated in your scene. I want you to think about that. If I just place it here, it's not instantiated. It's just ready to be instantiated when I press play. Okay? Anything that's not in the game scene here, unless I programmatically make it appear here, will not exist, even if it's inside of your assets. Okay? So lots of information. But let's make something move or do something, because this is really boring, right? So we always start off with basics. And I want to start off with some basic primitive shapes. So let's do the same thing we did last time, except I want to be able to save my scene. And the way you save your scene, if I press Command or Control S right now, it's going to ask me to save my scene somewhere. I have a scenes folder. I'm going to double click in there, and I'm going to change this scene to be saved as the main scene. Now I have my main scene saved, and you can see that it says main at the top here, right? I have a main camera, and I have a directional light. Now the great thing about Unity is it includes standard assets, and it includes primitive assets. Primitive assets would be things like plane, cube, cone, sphere, different things that you can test your game out with, right? Think about them as placeholder images or assets that you can use. But we can also use Unity's standard assets. Unity's standard assets include a whole pile of stuff, and I can get really good stuff within about 10 minutes. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Now this is just a demo. So I'm going to go to Assets. I'm going to go to Import Package. Import Package allows me to download and install any built-in or standard assets from Unity, right? So these are not, I haven't made these things. This is something coming from Unity. I'm going to go into Characters here, right? Under Characters, when I download and install the standard asset, you can see that it's going to add a bunch of stuff to my hierarchy, my scene, right? In a second. Now, I don't have to choose all this stuff. I can choose only some of the stuff. And when you do your learning with Unity, right, there's going to be some of the things that you don't want. I don't want the roller ball. I don't care about this right now. So I'm going to uncheck this part. But I will keep my third-person character, and I will keep my first-person character as well, those two. And then I'm going to click Import. Import will take a little bit of time. It's going to drag the assets into my assets folder, and it's going to create another folder called standard assets in a second. Notice how it's importing everything. There it is, standard assets. Now, I don't like standard assets because standard assets hides down here. I want them to be away from my stuff. This is all my stuff normally, right? I want them to be up here somewhere. So I want to rename standard assets into something like imported assets. This is okay if you're done importing your assets. But let's suppose I am. So this is up here now. Good. Now what I want to do is I also want to download some other assets. Let me just do that one more time. And I'll show you can combine everything. So here's import package. Let's also download some prototyping. Prototyping gives me things like, as an example, it gives me things like sprites and a bunch of other stuff that I want, right? Notice that it already has all of this because I added my prefabs and everything else, right? But what I want to add here is my a grid, some kind of plane, other things that this adds in there. So I'm just going to add them in again. It's going to go back into standard assets. And now what I can do is if I double click, if I click over here on my imported assets, again, I can move these objects around so you can see them. Here's my imported assets. I can always go to my standard assets and I can grab prototyping and drag it in. Now my standard assets is empty and I can get rid of it. Just wanted to show you that so you don't have to do it any different way. And now I got lots of stuff to do. And I can pretty much make my game now, the one I want to make with you guys. So here's my prototyping. I want to go in there. I want to go into models or prefabs. Remember, prefabs are objects that have already been made for me, right? They're ready to go. They're scripted sometimes. They got material on them and everything. I want to grab the prefab that says platform prototype, and there's one that's a or a floor prototype, which is 64 by 64, and drag it onto my scene. Now you can see where it went. I want it at 0, 0, 0, so I want to put it at the origin, right? I could have reset it by pressing the reset button up here. Again, like I said, sometimes an asset will be difficult to see, and if you go up in the top left here, you could change the color of it to indicate what it is, right? So you can label assets this way as well, and you can also turn them off. All right, so this is my asset. Kind of rotate here a little bit so you can see it. And you notice where my camera is. So what my camera actually sees now is this. I'm going to get rid of my camera. I don't want it. I want to make a first-person perspective game. I want to walk around on this place, right? So I'm going to get rid of my camera. Now, if I go back to my scene, I see nothing because there's nothing to see in my scene. My camera is required in order for me to see anything, right? However, I do know that in my characters folder, I have a first-person character, which gives me a first-person perspective. Think about the camera coming out of my eyes when I'm walking around, right? Like when you play any first-person shooter game, the camera is walking around, right? So I'm going to go into prefabs. I'm going to grab my FPS controller, right, and drag it onto the scene. Notice it comes with the camera. If I want to focus quickly on something in the scene, I can press the F key to frame select it. Notice that the prefab is half buried in the ground. You can see that it's not exactly outside of my ground. I want to pull this up a little bit. And you can see now that it has a bit of a cylindrical shape to it, or a capsule, if you will, right? The capsule represents the collider. This is the actual shape of the collision area if I was to collide with my shape. It also has what looks like a speaker attached to it and a camera. The speaker is actually a listener to listen for any sounds, right? Now let's play. I can look around with the mouse. This is built in by using standard assets. I can walk around and I can jump, right? In three-dimensional space. Pretty boring, though. So let's add an enemy. How do I do that? Well, I can go to third-person character, and inside my prefabs, I do have an AI third-person controller, right? Remember, these are prefabs. And look at my hierarchy now. I have an FPS controller, I have a directional light, and a floor prototype. We're going to get back to this in a second. And I've dragged it over from here to here. Now I'm going to drag it from here to here and see the difference. Here's my AI third-person controller. Drag it in. It's part of my scene, and there I see an object. Let me focus in on it by pressing the F key. And now I'm going to pan around by using the Alt or Option key and my left mouse button. So I'm going to tumble around them so I can see them. I'm going to zoom in by scrolling in with my scroll wheel. And I'm gonna just grab the hand, right, or press down on the middle scroll wheel and just pan out. I can get really close to him so you can see what he looks like, right? This is Ethan. He's the standard asset that comes with Unity. And he's pretty cool, and it's a pretty complex model, actually. Notice that there's also a capsule around this Ethan. This is the collider. This is how I would collide with Ethan. If I run it the way it is right now, he won't do anything. He'll just sit there. And he has a bit of an animation. Let's run around. Here he is. He's Ethan. He's not going to chase me, right? He's just sitting there. No scripting. Zero scripting. I've got a first-person perspective going, and some kind of AI that has a little bit of animation but doesn't do anything right now. Let's change some of these names, right? For example, FPS controller doesn't make any sense. I want to call this by clicking once and clicking again, or you can do it here or here, right? I want to change this to player, right? I can click here or here. I want to change this to enemy. Enemy, right? And notice that the enemy has, the object has sub-objects, right? For example, the enemy, Ethan, is made up of an empty object with a bunch of other components on top. Remember, we're using the component model. Every object has a transform, and all the other components are extras that you add on as like plugins. You plug in components to the object to give it more capabilities. That's how Unity works, right? So notice I have those things, plus I have sub-objects, like my skin mesh renderer. My glasses is a separate object, which I can hide, right? Or show by clicking this button. And of course, this button is configurable through programmatically, so you can turn it off and on. There's also the Ethan skeleton. The Ethan skeleton is actually the bones that I can use, right, to program how Ethan's animation works. Now, this is way beyond the scope of this course, but I wanted to show you all the piece parts that you can get for free. My first-person character is not actually a first-person character. It's my player cam. That's my actual camera right there. That's what this thing is. And you can't see it right now because it kind of hovers over here, right? But if you want to see it, you can simply turn it on. So I'd rather put my player on so you can see it. Here's my player. And then this is my enemy, right? Player, enemy. My enemy can't go anywhere, though. Now, my enemy, the great thing about my enemy, it's got a bunch of built-in things. One of them is this idea of a nav mesh agent. Nav stands for navigation. Mesh is anything that it navigates around. And an agent itself is a bit of AI that's been pre-programmed into it so that it will do things like choose a target. We need a target for Ethan to follow, and we know we have a target. What's the target? Me, the player. And so notice that there's a component here that says AI character control, and the target has none. But it's waiting for, it tells you what it's waiting for, a transform. That means any other object that it can target, like the player. I can grab the player, and I can drag and drop it over here. So now the target for Ethan is the player. Target means that he is going to try and move towards me every frame, for the entire scene. Except he doesn't know where to move right now because he doesn't have a nav mesh built into the ground. Let's make one. But before I get there, let's add a couple of extra stuff, that he has to kind of run around. I don't want him to, right now it's too easy for him. There's nothing blocking him, right? Let's add some other stuff. So we can simply do it by going to my prototyping, looking at my models, and or my prefabs, and take a look at maybe a house prototype. There we go. Grab this house. I'll put it into the scene. There we go. That's a pretty massive house, right? So I can maybe run around the house, right? You can see it's pretty massive. This is where I would probably scale, right? My scale is 111. Maybe what I want to make this is like 0.25 by 0.25. Kind of a smaller house because it's too massive for me, right? And if I kind of go to the house itself, I kind of frame select the house. That makes more sense, right? Just for my scene, the way my scene's laid out. It's more of a shed now than a house, right? Notice that everything looks blue, but the great thing is it has a bunch of default materials like navy gray, pink. Let's make my house pink. So what I want to do is take my pink material. Notice that material means it has a diffuse property, right? It also has a specular shininess property. It has a bunch of other properties that make up the material, the thing that wraps around the object to give it some detail, right? And I can take my pink grid and I can drag and drop it onto this, and now my house is pink, right? I'm making very, very quick. I'm not really giving you a lot of detail here, but bear with me. Now that I have a house, maybe I'll add one more thing and then we'll get moving. I'm gonna go back to prefabs and I can have other things here. Like for example, maybe some steps. Here's some steps. And if I zoom into the steps, you can see where they're placed in three-dimensional space. Maybe I'll make them come closer so I can climb up to my house. And you can see that it's kind of hard sometimes to see whether the steps are, going into my house or not. Let's make the steps a different color because it's kind of boring, right? So I'm going to hit materials again, go to my yellow grid and drag and drop. Oops, that's the one. I didn't want that. Control Z, Command Z undoes like normal. There we go. Cool. All right, now I'm going to click on my material, this one, the floor, and I'm going to rename this thing floor or ground. And I can change the steps to something else if I want, right? Let's just call them steps. And the house to a house. If I can type. There we go. You can see that you can modify the names of these. Are all the things that are in your scene. Let's save the scene. Command S, Control S. We'll save. Now, if I forget or if my program crashes, which can happen because you're dealing with three-dimensional stuff, especially if you have a laptop that only has like 4 gigs of RAM or something crazy, right? But you can still run Unity with it. It's just really slow, right? You want to save your scene just in case something bad happens. Okay, great. Now, we've got a couple of windows here. We've got the hierarchy window, the project window, and the inspector window. But you know what? It'd be nice if I had the ability for me to add a navigation mesh on there. And to do that, I can add additional windows. On the right, you can see that I have a window. And if I scroll down, I have the option of adding another window called navigation. Now, I have the ability for me to add another navigational area, a place where you can walk. I need to click this, the area where I want them to walk on, right? And notice it says I have agents, areas, these different areas. I can click bake if I really want to bake the object, bake the navigation mesh on, right? So agents, areas, bake, and object. If I go to bake, and if I've selected this object the way it is, notice there's some properties that I can adjust. Like for example, the agent height, the maximum scope, and so on. I can click bake, and now wherever I have it selected is where the agent can move around. Now notice I've somehow selected this house, which is not what I wanted, right? Let's clear it. So I want to kind of bake this area here, right? And wherever I bake, whatever area that I decide to connect with, like not the steps itself. So if I click on steps, and if I go down here and bake, right? shouldn't work that way. I love it. That's good. Things that work out exactly differently than you want them to, right? That's not what I want. I want it to be only areas that I can walk, right? So areas that are walkable and so on. One thing that I haven't defined as yet for my ground in the inspector is what the area is. It's untagged. You can hit different tags here. For example, I can tag the area that I have here as static if I want to, or I can tag it as the type of area it is. If I don't have something that's in here, I can add a tag of my own. Tagging is great when I want to connect to something with code. I want to talk about my ground. So far, we haven't talked about code. How do I script something about my ground? I connect to it with a tag usually. So usually I can create my own custom tags. So we'll call this the ground. There we go. And then when I go back to the inspector, so if I click on the ground and go back to the inspector, I can select it. I can also do the same thing with my player. So I can choose my player and then choose player, right? And other things like that. So I got my ground, and well, here's my navigation. And notice that I have walkable. This is the stuff I can do with my navigation mesh, right? Here are my different agents, right? My humanoid agent, right? And what they can do. I can add different agents if I have one. And these are my areas, or bake. My bake, from a workflow perspective, it'll tell you how everything works. It's interesting that it tells you how to get started with navigation mesh here. If you ever want to have any API documentation, Unity is fantastic for it. In fact, if you wanted to go to Unity to learn how to do Unity, you can go to Unity3D and click on Learn. And there's a ton of tutorials that are for free that you can learn what to do with, right? For example, how to do things like creating a space shooter, or how do you do a tanks game, or other kind of tutorials to make things work. Lots and lots of free stuff that Unity gives you. And the other thing I really like about Unity is the fact that it has an amazing API documented engine, right? So if I click on documentation, right, then here's your Unity manual. Let's bring this down a little bit. I'm not sure why it's 150. But if I want to look at things like UI, or if I click on, for example, navigation mesh, and I kind of search for that, it'll bring up, here's the navigation system, how to build a nav mesh, right? Everything but everything you have here is built, right? So here's the first part. Select a scene geometry that should affect the navigation, walkable surfaces. 2, check include objects in the nav mesh baking process, okay? And if you follow that process, right, by the way, yeah, of course, I didn't click it. And then I chose it as walkable, right? If I go to bake now and click bake, then that whole area will be walkable. Now that I have that, if I press play, you can see that, oh man, he's on me, right? And no matter where I am, he's going to chase me, even if I run away with the shift key. Like behind this house. I'm safe. Wait a minute. Hey. But what if I'm up here? Can he follow me up here? No, because poor Ethan, he doesn't know what to do, right? Especially if I go on top of the roof, right? He doesn't know what to do now. He can just follow me around and see if he can see me, right? Well, as soon as I land here, he's on me automatically. I can give more space for navigation. If I click on the stairs, like I said, we do the exact same trick. I add navigation static. This is going to be weird what you're going to see what he does here, right? The area is walkable. There's different objects here, right? Or jump. And if I click bake again, notice that there's an area that is an area he can walk on, but not the whole area is connected. It's not like I have control so much. The minimum region area is 2, right? But there's also an agent radius, how much it is, and the maximum slope, which is 45 degrees, right? I can affect all this stuff, step height and everything else to make it so that it's walkable. Let's see if I can get there this time. Is he on me already? Oh, man. What the heck? Safe. What? He's trying. He's trying to get to me. But there's a problem with the stairs, right? He is trying to climb up, but he can't get up. It's the grade and probably the step height that he's having a problem with, right? So I can still kind of get away from him. And this is fantastic, but he's not much of a challenge on his own, right? Especially if I want to shoot him or something, right? Well, remember we talked about prefabs, right? And Ethan himself, I mean, he has some built-in properties. If I look at my Ethan body, right? If I look at the inspector, he has the mesh Ethan body, but he also has Ethan gray as a standard material, right? If I want to use something else or changes Ethan gray to something else, right? So let's go back to Ethan for a second and I zoom in on him. Want to change him to something to look like something else? I can totally do that, right? By changing this color right here, this albedo. I can change it so that he's more red or something more realistic. Now, he doesn't have any kind of other material wrapped around him to make him look awesome. But if you want to, you can. I think there's skins you can download from as well. Let's make him a little bit more red because, you know, enemies are red, right? Okay, cool. But what if I didn't just have one Ethan, one enemy, but I had lots of them? Remember, back to our assets, I have this prefabs folder. Even though I made Ethan from a prefab that came from my imported assets, I can still drag and drop him into my scene here, into my assets as a prefab. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Grab Ethan, the enemy, and drag it inside my prefabs folder. When I do, the great thing is I have access to making as many of these as I want, like this, right? So now there's two of them. They both have the same properties. They both will follow me until they catch me, right? And I can keep doing that, right? I can also duplicate. Now that I made him a prefab, I can click duplicate. And here's another one. So you see enemies, now that they're prefabs, right? I can have as many of them as I want in the scene. Now it's really tough for me to play with this many enemies so close, right? So I'm gonna have to move my player around a little bit. Let's give him a head start, right? And see what happens. See if he's fast enough. Am I fast enough? Hey, what happened to that guy? How come he's not following us? What's going on with Ethan? Which one isn't following us anyway? Right? There's 3 Ethans, but only this one guy is not following us at all. What's happening? How come he's not? There's a reason for this, right? Even though we've made him a prefab, some stuff that happens in a prefab doesn't carry forward. Here's an example of this. Here's my enemy. Notice that when we dragged and dropped Ethan in here last time, or dragged and dropped my enemy information last time, in my nav mesh agent, right? I had to choose the player transform, right? So this is the player. Here, for this one, right? And I'm looking at enemy number 1, which I dragged and dropped from a prefab, right? Does not have a target. And this happens frequently with prefabs, that you can't use a dragged and drop target like the player to select. So that means even though I've dragged and dropped him into my scene, programmatically, sometimes I have to make this happen. So here he's connected because I duplicated him, but this one came from my enemy, from my prefabs folder, and that's why he didn't have a predefined target. All right. If I click on him now, you can see that now they're all chasing after me, right? And I'm gonna have a really hard time unless I go on the stairs where they can't get to me, right? I'm gonna try and get to me. They're trying hard, and it looks kind of weird. Some of them are even floating around there, right?
Why should you have prefabs if you can just copy and paste?
Copy pasting isn't the same, right? Remember, a lot of times I don't have. Well, this guy's gonna fall off the world, right? Ooh, that was weird. Oh yeah, this guy's really weird. He's really weirded out. This guy. Look at. Oh yeah, now they're after me. Oh yeah, haha, you can't get me. I can turn faster than you. But what happens if I keep falling until I get to the edge of this world that I made? What's going to happen to me? I'm going to fall forever, right? Until there's no until. I'll keep falling. And for you to see that, if I looked at my player stats, you can see that in real time, I have control over my player and what's happening. If I want to, I can right now go back and put me at 0. And I can change this number as many times as I want, or maybe put him at, instead of 0, I can reset his position. So this is 0. This is important. This is the only thing that's following the Y, right? And this is 0. Then maybe I'll put this one at, something like 30. Right? And guess what now? I'm back on my world. Oh, I'm back with the Ethans again. No, you bad Ethans. You can't get me until I fall off again. Yeah, they got me. Didn't take me long to build this thing out. But the thing that I wanted to show you here today is wanted to get you to understand the interface, how everything works, right? So this part here, again, is the inspector where everything is, I have control of everything here. So far, everything I've done is I've done things by dragging and dropping. I've got not one script that I make myself, right? Okay, to finish off, let's make a little script. And if I was going to give you a project, and again, if you tell me if you want me to, I will, right? Take your assignment. This is the project assignment that I gave you last week, right? Use the same assets and the same code, right? Make your slot machine. Make it in 2D. And what you need to do for that is the following. So I'm going to save this, by the way. Now, remember, I created this project, but I haven't put it up on GitHub yet. And I want to give you this stuff on GitHub. But before I do that, I want to do one thing. Under File, I can save my scene. Under File, I can save my project. Right? Those two different things. Under File, I can also look at build settings. With build settings, I have the ability to target different devices. iOS devices, tvOS devices, Android devices, Tizen, that's Samsung, right? WebGL, Samsung TV. If you want to satisfy that Samsung TV requirement, here it is right here, right? Facebook Now, PS Vita, PS4, Xbox One, as well as, with this version, the Switch. You have to download another patch to make it work. Let's choose the way it was before, PC, Mac, and Linux. That's the default. Notice that my target platform is Mac OS, right? x86-64. I can also choose Windows or Linux, right, to deploy. It'll actually create a build that you can run, a runnable, right? I can also add any open scenes. In order for me to run it, I need to add my open scene. So, for example, my open scene is main. That's one I made, right? And then I can simply click build. But build is going to ask me to, or build and run, is going to ask me to tell me where do you want me to put my builds? And I want to put them in the builds folder. So notice that it takes me outside of the assets folder. This is my actual operating system now I'm looking at. I want to make a folder called builds. Inside my builds folder, I want to call this Mac OS. Right? And then click save. And now what it'll do is it'll start compacting and building my application. It'll take my packages and assets, put them together so I can make a runnable build. Right? Now, it doesn't take long if it's 3D. But if I choose, I can choose a 1280 by 720 or whatever I want. I can make it also windowed, which is probably best for us. And then I'm going to click play. And now I have a view that is almost full screen and much nicer than the actual the view that I'm going to get in my my development environment. Right? Whoa, they're jumping. They're trying to get me. I also jump very far. Maybe I can jump over them. Yeah. Bye, Ethans. You can't get me. I can even look at them at the house. Where are you guys? Are you floating again? Whoa. Trying. It's just the way I coded it, right? So it's a runnable. You can actually, I can take this thing and give it to you guys. If you have a Mac, you can run it. No problem. Now here's the challenge with this. Remember I told you there's no connection with GitHub, but there is something else called Colab, right? And what Colab does is allow me to run things on the cloud, right? I can upload this whole thing, this whole project to the cloud, and you can download it or test it or whatever. which is kind of really cool. I'm not going to do that today, right? But what I will do is quit. And I want to be able to find my application on my desktop. And usually I have a project folder called Unity Projects. And at the top usually is where I have my, or if I modify my date, this is the one that I did today. So I got to use my terminal for this. This is the only way that it can be done. Right? So if I go CD space and I drag and drop this just like normal, right? Just like normal, right? That was weird. And if I look at my folders, right, everything is good. The only thing that I don't want is I don't ever want my builds folder to go up on GitHub, right? And the reason for this is it could be rather large. Like, look, I just made this little simple project. And with everything, if I get info on this thing, right, it's pretty big, like 192 meg big, right? And if I look at deeply on where's all the assets, part of it is inside my assets because I downloaded all those imported assets that I don't use, right? A part of it's in my builds. And if I look at my builds folder just by itself, I can see that 84 megs of it is in my little builds folder. So that little scene that I made, majority of it came from builds, by building it. And it's the same thing when you build it for iOS, right? So you never want to include builds because you're going to build it on your own, right? Okay, cool. So that's one thing. So I need to have a gitignore file. And just to demonstrate this, I'm going to pull it into VS Code because I like to use VS Code for this kind of thing, right? So here's my VS Code. And again, you can use any code editor for this. But what I like to try and do is pull in this project here. Now, this is the Unity project, right? So I'm going to, inside my root of my folder, I'm going to make a new file called a gitignore file. Gitignore. And inside there, I want to specify builds. So builds will be ignored when I add it into my, to GitHub. I want to click on this little Git folder, right? I want to initialize my Git repository here. Here it is. I want to add all of these to the staging area, everything here. It's going to take me a bit of time. And when I'm done, I want to call this my initial commit. I want to click on this little check mark. And I don't have a remote yet, but I will get one by opening up the terminal, right? Here's my terminal, right? And then what I want to do here is on GitHub, I want to specify another target. So I want to go MAPD 124 W2017, then lesson 12 Unity. Yeah, I called it that. Maybe I didn't. Here we go. And I want to grab these last two lines here, go back to here, and paste and go. And then, of course, I always want to allow, so it transfers everything up to GitHub. You can see this takes a bit of time, and I'm transferring megs and megs. One thing you have a limitation for with GitHub is you cannot transfer files, individual files larger than 100 megs, right? The whole project, no problem. I've transferred gigs on GitHub, right? But individual files can't be big. And unfortunately, with your builds, some of those files are rather big sometimes. So if you want to check this out later on, if you want to download my project and view it on Unity, go here and grab it and download it for your later use. For you, to end off for the day. What we did today was 3D. But what I want, the challenge for you guys is to build it with 2D, right? Your slot machine. 2D is a whole other monster, which we'll talk more next week, right? In fact, all week next week, we're going to talk 2D and how to transfer your game over to Unity. Yes, which we'll talk about. Don't worry. It's not so difficult as you think, right? Remember, if you learn Swift, C# is easy, right? Java and C# is way easier than Swift, right? In my opinion. Let's go back to Unity 1 second before we end up for the day, right? And let me show you what you need to do. With Unity, if you want to run your slot machine, it's best to start off with a 2D project. I'm going to click New. And I'm not going to give it any particular name. I'm just going to choose 2D and none of this. So new Unity Project 1, that's fine. Click Create Project. And when I do that with Unity, it sets the camera up a little differently. Instead of being a projected camera, projection, right? 3D projection. It's going to sit at the camera's going to look orthographic, so flat. Now this is your canvas. I want you to think about this view here as your storyboard. right? Anything that goes in this view, right, is the ability, you can drag and drop images in here. Now, we already have images for your slot machine, yeah? Remember? I'm just going to bring them in. So if I go into your folder, so if I go into courses, and if I go into MAPD124 and grab those files, right? Did I put them here? I may have. Here's some images. I want to grab all these images, right? And under assets, I want to make a new folder called textures, like I did before, right? So a new folder. We'll call them textures, right? And I'm going to grab all these images here, including everything. That's not the images folder, just everything else inside of it. If I want to, I can grab the whole folder too. Actually, it might be easier to do this. So grab images and just drag and drop it in here. What Unity will do is convert everything. So now I can grab this and put it in there. There we go. There's images. Great. Here's the slot machine. That didn't take long. Here's the game. I'm halfway there, guys. I'm telling you, it doesn't take long at all, right? Unity is an amazing tool. And one thing I want you to think about is this. I wouldn't do free aspect here. I would probably do something like 320 by 480 because that's a cell phone size, yeah? So I'm going to change this by adding a new aspect ratio. I'm going to call this something like, you know, mobile, right? And change this to 320 by 480. Press OK. Now you can see that it's a little bit too big, my slot machine. But this is what it's going to be viewing. This is the proportions that I'm saying. You can see that here, right? How right now my object is too big. So I can scale it. Now my main camera is also a factor, right? My main camera sees things at size 5. I can change it to size 4. Notice the preview. Or size 3, right? Or if I want to, which is far, far better, I can go specific sizes. So example, my slot machine graphic, right? If I was to look at what it is, right? It's using the slot machine renderer, this image, right? And my slot machine itself is just a sprite, right? I could change this so that it is proportional. Now, right now, it's 100 to 1. Let me talk about what I'm talking about here. Let's get rid of my slot machine 1 sec. And I'll let you go after this. Swear. Slot machine. Notice it's a sprite, but my pixels per unit is 100. 100 pixels per unit. That's not right. My slot machine is 767 by 1024, right? If I made it 1 to 1, right? 1 to 1, not 100 pixels per unit. And if I was to drag and drop my slot machine back onto the scene, right? It's massive, right? Apply. In fact, it's so massive that it would look like this, and my game would just see white, right? But the reason why it's doing that is because of my main camera. My main camera is based on the size of my screen, right? So if I want to see it at 320 by 480, I want to go half the size of my screen in size, something like 240, right? And I want to shrink this thing down so it matches the size that I want it to be, right? Typically what I would do is I would do this outside of this program instead of another program if I wanted to go 1 to 1, right? But I could also do it by eye here. So let's try it. And then drag and drop. And we can get pretty good here by putting it side by side, right? And you can see that as I drag and drop everything in here, I can get pretty good in terms of positioning, right? This is 320 by 480, right? Which means mobile centric. I can do this now, right? Remember, my slot machine was never made perfectly for your mobile devices, right? You made yours. That's why it looks so nice, right? And you made yours look the way it does for iPad. But this is what it looks like here. Hey, now that I have this, I can do the same trick to all these other buttons. For example, my spin button. My spin button is also 100 pixels to 1. I can make this 1 to 1. I can apply the changes, and then I can drag it in, right? Once I drag it in, it becomes an object, right? Now, if I can't see it, here, let me go back into here. here's my object. And notice where it appears here in my scene. It's way back here, and I can't see it. Why? Because of the position in layer, right? It's pretty simple. Once you know how to make interfaces, you always know how to make interfaces, right? So I want to move this down here. I want to resize my button so it makes sense until it becomes what I want it to be. And once I've got the positioning and the placement over here, I can certainly place my other buttons in the scene. And slowly, slowly, you can build your application. The coding is simple, and we'll talk about the scripting next week. But yeah, there's C# scripting involved. But it's so simple and silly that you're going to be able to do it in a very short time. In fact, I'll give you the script that's Unity compatible, right? Just to make it work, which is what I did anyway with you, right? Questions around Unity, right? Lots of power. The great thing about Unity is you can rapidly produce any application, whether it's an interface. It doesn't have to be games. You can use it for other things too, right? It can connect to data on the back end. It has access to Firebase. There is a Firebase API for Unity. It has access to create multiplayer games. You can make multiplayer games, single-player games, first-person shooters, platformer games, all kinds of other stuff on that comes here. And then once you've done it one place, you can deploy everywhere, right? On Android, iOS, on different platforms, on watches, whatever you want. It's fantastic for that. On the downside, it's not native. You're going to get near native performance because everything you do with Unity is converted into C++, right, at the end of the day, before it actually runs, right, which is a good thing. But it's not native. It's not on the metal like everything else, right? So you're going to get a bit of performance loss. And the other thing that's a little different with Unity is it's going to look Unity-like, right? Because it's the engine. Every engine has its own way of doing shaders and lights and everything else. And you can tell sometimes, depending if you've used the engine enough, how it's been made, right? But a fantastic little program, I would say. And I would say it's the most popular game engine out there right now. Any other questions? We'll get back to this next week, but if you're interested in starting, then the best way to do this is grab Unity, again, install it on your system next week, and what we'll do is we'll start. It won't take you long to put it together. You already have your code. Think about it. All your code that you want to run, everything you've done on your iOS device, you're halfway there if you think about it. All you can do is take that code, convert it to C#, and you're done. Guys, thank you so much. We'll see you next week. I'll put this up on GitHub as well.